Not being that institution, he's just paying us, how do you say, to cover people's time. So we can charge, we can say, we spend time with this person, pay for it.
Okay, let's get started. Let me have your attention, please. Let's get started. Welcome to the University of Tennessee Nuclear Engineering Department Colloquium Program. My name is Lee Dodds, and it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, who is a very special person, as you will see from the introduction. The speaker is Dr. Lefteri Tsoukalas, who is head of the School of Nuclear Engineering at Purdue University. Lefteri received a BS in Electrical and Computer Engineering from the University of Illinois in 1981, and an MS in Nuclear Engineering in 1983, followed by a PhD in Nuclear Engineering, also from the University of Illinois, in 1989. In between the MS and the PhD, he worked for 3 years for the architectural engineering firm Sargent & Lundy in Chicago. He came to the University of Tennessee in 1989, and he was with us for 3 years as a postdoc appointment, research faculty. After leaving UT, he went to Japan and worked for Jerry for a year in 92, 93. And then in 93, 94, he went back to his home country in Greece to Aristotle University. After his stint in his home country at Aristotle University, he joined the Purdue Nuclear Engineering faculty in 1994 as an assistant professor. And he rose from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor in 5 years, which has to be some kind of record for just about any university. And then to top it all off, in year number 6 at Purdue, he became the chairman of the department. He is a longtime friend of this department, and he is one of my very good friends. We have shared a lot of social times together, and it's so good to have him here. So without any further delay, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Lefteri Tsoukalas.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Thank you, Lee. I'm not sure I deserve all these kind words, but I definitely feel privileged to be here. This is home. I learn a lot of things here, and over the years we've maintained the collegial and personal relation with several people. This is a great department, great faculty, great students, and certainly a leader in the nuclear engineering discipline. Today I'm going to talk about something that requires an apology. And the apology is principally to the students. This is not a technical presentation. I don't have any equations. There is hardly any science involved in this. It's mostly judgments, opinions that you will get from me. But I think the subject is very, very important. And I feel very strongly and very passionately about this. And I ask for your indulgence. Please forgive me. This is not a technical colloquium, but it is something that we need to discuss, not only in order to understand what happens at the present, but also in order to prepare ourselves for the future. And the subject has to do with the global energy situation, and in particular, the peaking of the world energy supply, the world oil supply, I should say. So here is a outline of the presentation. We will talk in very broad terms and in a panoramic sense about the global energy supply and demand situation. We will talk about Hubbert's peak. It's peak oil. Hubbert's peak is a name that Professor Ken Duffy's from Princeton gave to this phenomenon. He published a book, an excellent book, a few years ago called Hubbert's Peak, and more recently another book called Beyond Oil. We'll talk about the implications of this peak in global oil supply, global oil production, and what is that needs to be done, and what could be the role of nuclear power in this. So, in very broad terms, here is our energy situation at present. The world consumes something to the order of 210 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. If we were to get it all from oil, this is the total energy consumption, about 210 million barrels of oil equivalent. Of this, about 84 million barrels is the demand for actual oil and liquid products that may be derived from natural gas and other sources. But it's about 84 million barrels a day. These numbers are not very hard numbers, and they're hard to find, even harder to find. But we have several people who look at this, and as far as the consumption, as far as what the world consumes, it's a little easier to calculate. It's even more difficult to calculate or estimate what the world is producing, in part because several of the producers are considering this data a state secret, so there is very little known about the actual production rates of the Middle Eastern, the giant Middle Eastern oil fields. But of course we can count tankers coming out of the Persian Gulf, and that's one of the ways we know how much oil is produced in the region. But roughly, the supply of oil, the global supply of oil, is about 84 million barrels a day. I know this is hard to believe, that there is no cushion, but that's basically where we are. And in order to have a stable market, you need to have at least 5% excess capacity. Otherwise, the market becomes a nervous Nelly. Every hiccup has the potential to develop instabilities in prices and so forth. Now, one of the great things that have happened in the last 20-25 years, and largely also with the incorporation of information technologies, is that we found a very good way to allocate this important resource. We essentially allocate it on a global scale by price. If you've got the money to pay, you get the oil. But that has also implications. So we have a very efficient way of allocating the resource, but there are some issues associated with the, to have this sort of allocation by price, you need to have capacities in place. You need to be able to produce it, you need to be able to transport it, to refine it, and so forth. And although the system has been wonderful, the energy markets have been wonderful, they seem to be somewhat biased against the investment, the infrastructural investments, the investment that results in building this capacity. So this is another issue that we're facing at present, is not only that the supply-demand situation is very, very tight, but several of the key capacities, particularly the refining capacity, seem to be stretched to the max. And also, as we will see a little later, not all oil is the same, comes in I've been a long time energy observer, and people who looked, our colleagues in chemical engineering know this very well. The different grades of oil, they come in very different forms, and increasingly we're getting sour crudes, the kind of things you make asphalt with, to come to the market, and a diminishing fraction of the light sweet crudes for which our refineries are built, particularly in North America and in Asia. Now, I need not tell you how important energy is for the modern world. Water, food, health, transportation, what we consider modernity has been based on oil. It's not just transportation fuels, or it's not just fertilizers, it's not just materials, it's not just pharmaceuticals. The ability to grow the supply of oil has been largely the collateral for the growth in the world's economic system. So we will come to ponder upon this a little later, but this is a very, very important. If we have difficulties in growing the supply, the extraction of oil, we will have to rethink the whole configuration of the global system, including the fundamental networks of banking, of financing, of transportation, of food production, distribution, etc. Now, how come and there's been such a diminished margin between the supply and demand? Well, one of the things that was largely unanticipated has been the astonishing growth in demand from China and India. China and India are countries that have huge populations, very old countries, very old civilizations, 2.3 billion people. They have discovered modernity. They have made giant strides in being part of the global system, and they're seeing rising standards of living. They're seeing the kind of urban and sophisticated lifestyles, consumer lifestyles, and the expectations for these lifestyles. And the best way to see this is to pay attention to this graph here. This is the per capita consumption, annual consumption of oil in the USA, in Japan, in Korea. Let me move closer to the board here to point. If you look from 1900, here is 1900 on, the US consumption of oil went from 1 barrel per person per year to roughly about 28, 27 around here, and has plateaued thereafter in 1970. Now this story here, this graph, is the story of the industrialization of the United States. It's when you build the roads, the factories, the schools, the hospitals. All of these things require energy, and particularly petroleum. And so this is the phase of development, and then we move into the service economy. Having consolidated these infrastructures, service economy, here is the consumption went down because of the oil crisis of 73 and 79, or oil disruptions, if you wish. Some people argue that these were not genuine crises. We still had nearly 30% excess capacity in the 70s, 15 million barrels of oil per day that could be lifted off the ground, and they were above the peak demand. Japan goes through a similar story, starts in 1950, very quickly goes up to about 17 barrels per person per year, and South Korea, a similar sort of trajectory. This is again the industrialization, the development. This is where you come to modernity. China today is at 1.7 barrels per person per year. And India, I believe, is about 0.7 barrels per person a year. The per capita consumption of petroleum is very low. They have enormous margins for growth. And essentially, even if a third of China, the coastal area of China, would come to somewhere close to the Korean level of consumption, we would have to need a couple Saudi Arabias to the supply side of oil. And that's really the critical aspect of the story. Not only the demand, China last year saw 20% growth in petroleum consumption. 20%. This is an astonishing figure. I don't think there's another country in the history of the world that has made this, and this year may be somewhat similar. So essentially what we have here is a process that cannot really be reversed. You cannot, the story is not about stopping China or India. In fact, if they stop, if in any way, if there is a message here that we should take, is that these are very powerful locomotives for growth in the global economy. The world's economy can grow for the next 50, 100 years by the momentum and the trajectory in which 2.3 billion people, a third of humanity, is at this moment. It's a very important event, and it's very important for all of us, and it's a great event, but there is this significant side effect. The supply of oil and energy in general is strained to the limits. Let me do this. We'll go forward. Yes, thank you. All right. Now, I use this for my, I'll come back to the podium, and I use this for my freshman engineering energy courses. If you were to do this for the students and to get a feel for the trade units we use, the per capita consumption of total energy, not just oil, total energy, in the US is about 65 barrels of oil equivalent per person per year. If you're going to get this from coal, you're going to have 20 tons of coal per person per year. From natural gas, 500,000 cubic feet of natural gas per person per year. If you're going to have it all, this energy from gasoline, it will be 2,800 gallons of gasoline per person per year. I don't want to, this is a nuclear engineering audience and is very keenly aware, but it's extremely important to see these numbers down here. If we're going to do this by converting mass into energy, which is what we do in fission and fusion, you probably need for each one of us something that is virtually hard to see, much less than a gram, 0.0056 grams of mass to be converted into energy. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. That's the direction. This is the direction for the future. Now, when it comes to Hubbert's peak, we really need to look at oil, although a somewhat similar phenomenon occurs with natural gas. And the oil situation today is characterized by the fact that close to 70, nobody really knows exactly. Some oil executives say 60, 57. Oil scholars, energy observers, energy analysts go as far as 80%, 70 to 80% of the reserves of the remaining oil is in 5 countries of the Persian Gulf, in this shoe horse area that Dr. Ali Bakhtiari has identified. You have essentially, in rough numbers, 70% of the remaining oil. In the 1990s, there was huge implementation of new technology in the world's oil fields, and the extraction rates increased in several places. Very successful use of horizontal drilling, where you can go now, you think of this oil column in simplified terms, the oil-water contact underneath. You think of it as oil under pressure, a reservoir of oil, and as you pump, as the oil comes out under its own pressure, and this is essentially what happened since the development of the modern oil fields, this column gets thinner. It's a slice that, for example, in the Ghawar field of the Saudi, the largest oil field in the world, it was, in idealized terms, a slice of about 150, 200 meter thickness, and now it gets thinner, shorter and shorter, and water keeps moving up. And of course, gas separates on the top as the pressure drops. But you can go in with horizontal drilling, and you can take it from where is under higher pressure. It's not really uniform. So you get these pockets, you drill it from there. So, and in addition, you can use water injection to prop the pressure up. So this technology has really made a huge difference, and in many ways, in the 1990s, it generated wonderful flow rates at the wellheads, but also it generated the belief that there is no problem with oil. It's one of the factors that contributed to a process of mystification, if you wish. In addition, and I think that's something that was missed by a lot of the energy experts, was that the abundance of gas in the world's oil fields is really, in very broad terms, is symptomatic of depletion. It's not the discovery of a new resource. So then let's go to talk about Dr. Hubbert and his methodology, because essentially his focus was in depletion. And back in the 1940s, 1949, I believe, it was his first paper, and then 1956 he wrote another paper. And interestingly enough, his paper in 1956 was essentially an argument for the need for nuclear power, because this was shortly after the Atoms for Peace program that President Eisenhower had announced. And what Hubbert was saying is that if you look at the individual fields, individual oil fields, it takes some time to discover, after you discover, it takes some time to develop the field. And the fields seem to be going through a process of maturation where you get growing production for several years, and then the production is plateauing or reaching a peak, and then you have irreversible decline. No matter how many holes you dig, you cannot extract more oil. So, and he hypothesized that this is true for individual fields, but for provinces, for regions, for continents, for the whole world. And his methodology was quite simple, and I explained the next slide. But when it's important to appreciate that when he came up with this methodology, and he applied it to the North American, lower 48 states oil fields, and he predicted that in the 1970s, U.S. oil production will peak. And at the time, this was an irrational thing to say because the U.S. was an exporter of oil. It was the Saudi Arabia of the days, right? It was very, oil, it was a sign, and Texas and so forth was as important as Detroit. It was an emblem of the powerful, new country that had emerged after World War II. But sure enough, in 1970, U.S. production peaked, and we'll talk about this a little later. But let's look at his methodology. Hubbert's methodology is complicated. If you look at the technical side, you have a lot of differential equations and so on and so forth, pages and pages of equations. But the essential idea is quite simple, and it's the following. You can use exploration statistics to predict production statistics. Production is very difficult, even for the U.S. that has the best production data. It's very difficult to get production statistics. It's very difficult to answer the question how much oil is produced at any given time. And even more difficult to know that this oil production has problems in growing, or it may be reaching a plateau or a peak and get into irreversible decline. But Hubbert said you don't have to do this, you use the exploration statistics. He reasoned that there is a period of about 30 to 40 years between the first discovery, the first identification of a major oil field, and the peak in production, because it takes so many years to get all the pipes down and all the hardware and so forth. And so his hypothesis was that if you plot the first strikes, the first successful exploration well in time, you can use, you see they follow a pattern, a bell-shaped kind of distribution, and you can use the peak of that distribution to identify, you delay it by 30 to 40 years to identify a possible peak in the oil production. And he did this, actually here, this is what I have, he did this for the global oil production, and he predicted that in the early 2000, you may see a peak in the global oil production, which at the time seemed to be, he predicted that 30, 40 years ago. And at the time, it was a kind of radical idea. Of course, he was aware that the global discovery, the statistics of the global discovery curve had peaked in 1964. And even though there were a couple giant fields discovered in the late 60s, the Prudhoe Bay in Alaska and North Sea oil fields, and the Siberian fields, still the exploration statistics have been in decline since 1964. When you look at the United States, now with hindsight, we look back and sure enough, 1970 is the day of the peak. You have here the oil broken down by region, and I believe Louisiana includes a good chunk of the offshore. We started going into the Gulf of Mexico in the 70s and offshore production. Still, the U.S. was producing close to 6.5 million barrels per day in 1970, and in the lower 48 states is about 3.5 now. It's close to 3.5. Of course, we still have Alaska, but even there, we had the production peak in the late 90s and a significant decline since then. Could that happen on a global scale? Obviously, a hard issue to address on the basis of the scientific method, because it entails a lot of complexities and it has to do a lot with the future. But people have done this. Is the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, ASPO, and a lot of prominent geologists and academics and people who have an interest in the the larger picture of the world have been looking at this question. And the answer is yes, that there is a likelihood that we will get a peak in global oil production. We may already be at the peak or past the peak for light sweet crudes, the kind of oil that we use for heating and gasoline, and we may overall be peaking soon. So it is something that is contested. It's not hard science, but we have a growing number of people talking about the peak. One of the most interesting papers I have seen is in the Oil and Gas Journal of May 2004 by Dr. Bakhtiari, who claims that the peak is imminent, is around 85 million barrels per day, and has very sophisticated, nice simulation models to show that the decline could be very rapid, in the order of 6 to 8%. By 2020, global production may be down to 50 million barrels a day. Now, this is a very alarming figure, and it's really something that I suppose the healthy reaction is to ignore it. Denial works very well for problems that are extremely disturbing, but we have to really study it, because denial will only compound the problem if the problem comes. Now, several people have been talking about the peak in global oil production. Bakhtiari is one. Matt Simmons, this is a very, truly a very impressive individual. He's written a wonderful book. I believe he's done more than anybody else I've seen in the literature, even though he's not a technical person himself. But he's done a great service to this nation and to the world by looking very thoroughly into the energy and the oil data. And he's predicting a peak in this 2007, 2009 area. Colin Campbell, a preeminent geologist, Ken Defis from Princeton, Jean Laherrère in France. Of course, most of the oil companies and a lot of they say that the peak is not imminent. We have decades into the future. And that we all hope is the case, but we'll see the implications of that. Now, the literature is actually quite anemic. There isn't much on peak oil, and there's a lot of websites, a lot of different people, but there isn't much that is done scientifically. However, in the earlier part of this year, there was a very serious study, and I think deserves a lot of attention. It's called the Hirsch Report. It's actually a couple of things and presentations that have come up. And the report has looked at mitigation strategies. What if the peak is a true thing? What do we do? What should we be doing? Given the fact that the U.S. consumes about 20 million barrels of oil per day, 2/3 of which are going for liquid fuels, for diesel, for 9 million barrels roughly of gasoline, 4.5 million barrels of diesel, 1.5 million barrels a day of jet fuel. So this is a very worthwhile report, and I recommend that everybody takes a look at this. But the main thesis of the report is that there is no energy crisis. The peak affects the liquid fuel situation, liquid fuels. However, as you will see in the mitigation strategies that are proposed, they're all very energy intensive. And one has then to answer the question, where are you going to get this energy to get all these alternatives to liquid fuels? there are lots of questions about this phenomenon, and certainly there's a great mythology about energy. The energy mythology, rivals Greek mythology, and part of it is because the thing is done so well that it's so transparent to most people, and they tend to think that energy is a kind of natural phenomenon, like the air and the sunshine. There's also not so many people work in energy. In the U.S., I believe in the 70s, you had about 1.5 million people working in this industry in a global sense, and now probably less than 500,000. So not too many people, and it's done well, and it's very transparent. So the mythology is incredible. We haven't really discussed, we haven't understood on a scientific and systematic way what the implications of a peak in the production of oil and of course the irreversible decline that follows will be for modern the kind of institutional arrangements we have that make the modern world being what it is. The financial networks, the transportation networks, the food production, distribution networks, waters, and most importantly, global security and global peace. Are we heading towards the worst energy crisis of modern industrial civilization? Some people argue again that the previous energy crises were mainly disruptions in the flow at the state of affairs, and not really a crisis where something new and radical had to be reconfigured, had to be thought of. Are we going to see a deterioration of the infrastructures, including the power grid, which is the best, the most highly available energy for humanity in the modern world? We see great volatility in the cost of energy. $100 a barrel is where the world's oil prices are heading, but that may even be too cheap. If you think about it in really daily terms, a 60 barrel of oil essentially translates into 18 cents a pint, which is not very much money. It's hardly anything in the supermarket that is less expensive than that. Are we going to see $20 per 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas? I believe that this winter will be critical, and because of the very perplexing decision to add about 220 gigawatts of electricity in the last 5-6 years, 220 gigawatts of generation were added to the national grid, roughly 15% addition to the national grid, and all of it is based on natural gas, and all of it was based on a prediction of the fuel cost in the range of $1 to $3 or $4 per 1,000 cubic feet, and now it's around $14, and it's heading north, and it's very likely that it may head towards 20 in the crunch of this coming winter. The astonishing thing is that there is really no plan B. There is no plan B. The efficiency of the energy markets, the fact that they're done so well on this daily basis, the phenomenal success of this infrastructure had generated an unbelievable complacency, not only amongst the citizenry or the consumers, but amongst the leadership groups. So what kind of mitigation strategies are possible? What is the cost of mitigation? Does the world have enough time to act? Is the problem too complex to grasp? And can we properly understand what this energy mythology entails? These are all questions and many more that need to be answered. Of course, there's also an energy eschatology. There's the end of the world. We always had millenarian streaks, in our intellectual and in pop culture. And there's some good arguments to be made. This is from Dioff and Richard Duncan, very, very respected academic, and a first-rate thinker. He's looked at the patterns of civilizations in terms of energy consumption, and basically he says modern civilization is probably from 1930 until about 230 or so. And then it will go back to the dark ages. But I beg to differ, and I think most of us who are in the business of education do believe that the greatest capacity of the human species is the capacity to generate ideas. So hopefully we will come up with new things, and next I will present to you some of the possibilities that are on the horizon. So we'll start with the We'll start with the mitigation strategies. But before that, let me point out a couple of things. Why did we get there? Why all this confusion about energy? I think to some degree it had to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the demand for oil in the former Soviet area went from about 12 million barrels per day to roughly 2 million barrels a day overnight, and therefore making available 8 to 10 million barrels a day for export. So the world was flooded with oil in some sense, and along with these exports was a powerful mythology exported in order to invite investment and so forth. 10 giant companies were formed in the 90s and very aggressively pervade the availability of great, fantastic resources, mineral resources, and in particular energy resources in the former area. For example, one of these things is the offshore Caspian. The floor of the Caspian was supposed to hold 260 billion barrels of oil reserves, equivalent to that of Saudi Arabia. But when the Western companies got their own data, the estimate is 9 to 12 million barrels, 16% sulfur. I believe that a couple months ago, Eni, the Italian oil company, pulled out completely of the Caspian exploration project. So there isn't really as much. There is oil around the Caspian, and that's been extracted since the 1910s, 1920s. But the myth of the Caspian oil is something that had caused a lot of complacency, a lot of excitement and complacency in the energy markets. The other one, of course, is these delusions about reserves. Here I have a table of the reserves, and I'll move closer to the board here, of the reserves that OPEC countries are reporting. This is self-reporting. And the striking thing is that the numbers don't seem to change very much. For example, if you look at, this is 1980, and it's important to keep in mind that in the 1970s, by the end of the 1970s, most Middle Eastern countries had nationalized their oil operations. And they've done overall a good job in managing this important resource for the world, and in providing, this incredibly good energy form to the world. But the reserve estimates are really somewhat incredibly, and there are reasons for it, but essentially, if you look at this table, you see, for example, that Iraq in 1980 claimed to have 31 billion barrels in store under the ground. And then 8 years later, the number nearly tripled to about 100 billion barrels. All along, they've been extracting oil, of course, and they're fighting a very bitter, terrible war with Iran. And when Iraq does this, almost everybody else seems to be jumping. Soon thereafter, Saudi Arabia, 163 barrels, and all of a sudden they jump to 257 and stay there about. So these are, it's not very good data. It's not very solid. They're really paper barrels. The reserves, now why they do this? Because they have a production system based on quotas. So if somebody says I have more reserves, he's entitled to produce more oil, and everybody else wants to produce more oil. And these were not, these were bad times in the oil business in the 80s and 90s. But are they representing reality? Now, the Saudi officials, the petroleum officials say that there is no problem. We can go to 1,000 billion barrels of reserves. But the situation is becoming really hard to believe, and a lot of people now are calling for a transparency for this in this important resource. Let me go to the next slide. I believe it is now. I was in Japan a couple summers ago discussing this with a colleague at Tokyo University, and I was informed that a lot of the Japanese high-pressure steel production is essentially sequestered by Saudi Aramco. The Saudis are using very heavily water injection, which is a technique they pioneered to keep the pressure up. But at present, they seem to be injecting anywhere from 15 to 18 million barrels of seawater in the ground to extract about 9 million barrels of oil. So they're heavily into secondary recovery. They have been, but this is a very risky situation. How the rate sensitivity of these fields, how you take production up, whether it's sustainable, whether you can stay at that for a long time, or whether you can collapse, pressure can go down, and you end up getting a lot of water at your wellhead. There's very little understanding, very little data about what is actually happening there, and there are a growing number of very respectable individuals who are calling for transparency in this issue. But clearly, the belief that the Saudi production can ramp up to 15 or even 20, 25 million barrels a day to offset the decline in the other oil fields is no longer, it's completely delusional. There is no basis for this, and is not holding much weight. Although I must say that the Ghawar field, for example, which is producing close to 5 million barrels of oil per day, is the kind of weather belt. If Ghawar peaks, the best oil in the world, largely very light sweet crude, if Ghawar peaks, there is no question that world oil production has peaked. I think this is required reading. Everybody here should be reading Twilight in the Desert. Matt Simmons has done the world a great service and has done this country a great service. Has anybody read the book? It is a wonderful book. It came out last summer. It's done very well. It has been well received. It really demystifies some of the illusions about oil. It basically, in a very careful, very systematic way, he says that the myth that the Saudi peak is decades away may be just that, a myth. And actually, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that Saudi oil production may be peaking or may have already peaked as far as light sweet crudes, and so does then the world. And peak oil is here, and we have to really get serious about this energy situation. Now, let me go back to the Hirsch report. The Hirsch report, as I mentioned earlier, focused on liquid fuels, primarily because this is one of the highest priorities in terms of the implications of peak oil. And also I think the DOE branch that was funding this had to do with it was the laboratory that looks into fuels. And the Hirsch report looks at 3 scenarios. Scenario 1 is when you don't do anything until the peaking occurs. And of course, you'll never know the peak until several years have passed. It's a kind of rear view phenomenon. Scenario number 2 is that you start doing things 10 years in advance before the peak. And scenario number 3 is that you start doing things 20 years in advance. And what is that, how do you understand the peak? Well, Hirsch and his colleagues used the picture I showed you earlier about lower 48 state production. They used it as a proxy for the world oil production peak. And basically, they assume certain things. They assume you have a peak. In fact, there is a kind of plateau. They assume that the demand grows, keeps growing. So they assume that we're here, this curve keeps going up, like this, at about 2% growth, which may not be, it's a very conservative estimate, and that the decline in the production, this curve, is about 2% also, which is also a very conservative estimate. In fact, a lot of people claim 6 to 8 or even more decline on the basis of what we have seen in the world's major oil fields. And the peak will be around somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 million barrels per day. So what can you do? Now, scenario number 1, you do nothing until the peak occurs. Is best shown here. Here is the peak. Here is the peak at this point, and you start doing after the peak. And the shaded area here is essentially your shortage. It's how much oil you will be missing from the world. And what you'll be able to put in place is this triangle here, and this is the new things, the tar sands and so forth. I'll talk about it in a minute. Scenario number 3, which is you start 20 years before the peak, shows that you can probably, all the things that you need to do, you have probably enough time to catch, to make up for the declining production of oil. And scenario number 2, which is the in-between case I'm not showing here, gives you some shortage, but also sufficient confidence that you're doing something. Let's go on to the next page. Okay, what are the mitigation options? Of course, they focus on fuels and increasing fuel efficiency. All of these things take time, but assuming that you start now, and it will take 3 or 4 years and so forth, gas to liquids, so you get liquids from natural gas and other things. You start working with oil sands, with tar sands, and coal liquefaction, enhanced oil recovery. What is not included as mitigation is nuclear power, solar, wind, because they're not liquids, they're electricity, and shale oil and biomass and hydrogen, which because they're not off the shelf. Let's look at these things in more detail. So to prepare for oil sands, you need about 3 years, and the impact you would have after 10 years, 10 years later, it would be that you would produce close to 8 million barrels of tar sands per day. Now, that's a very difficult thing to achieve. There's less than 1 million barrel per day now in Canada, as far as I know. And this is a very energy-intensive business. You need 1,000 cubic feet per barrel of oil produced. And natural gas in North America has already peaked. And as I mentioned earlier, the price is heading north. And whether you can sacrifice that much natural gas to produce tar sands in this kind of quantity, oil sands oil, it's a big question. But these are things that are doable. Go to the next one. So what you do, 15 years down the road, here is the breakdown. You have most of your missing fraction because of the decline in production, the global production of oil, will come from tar sands, from oil sands, from heavy oil and oil sands. And you need a lot of energy for this. Coal, liquids, and gas to liquids, they all require a lot of energy. So the important thing, though, is the message that the report sends is that you need lead times of about 10 to 20 years. And you cannot just, even with a crash program, even with a lot of resources, if you're really going to have impact, the mitigation strategies have to be put in place 10 to 20 years in advance. Let me get back here and advance a little bit. Of course, the other thing is that the Hirsch report looks at the U.S. market, and there's no analysis, and rightfully so, because they're very focused on their analysis of the global situation. Once the global oil production is in decline, the competition amongst countries and companies and regions for this resource will intensify. And that could, and we probably have significant perturbations in the global financial system. So how you can get to this situation is the next few slides. All right. The co-founder of Greenpeace, Professor James Lovelock, everybody knows, the Gaia hypothesis, preeminent environmentalist, has declared, not for peak oil purposes, but for global climate change purposes, that there is no sensible alternative to nuclear power if we're going to sustain civilization. I believe this is echoed very strongly. I can echo this very strongly when I look at the peak oil situation. Nuclear power is an option, existing option, came about because of tremendous and rapid advancements in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. But largely, it's been in hiatus in the last 30 years, certainly in North America. Nonetheless, a lot of operating experience, nearly 12,000 man-years, many reactors, 440 reactors. It produces about 16% globally of the global electricity production. And there is quite a bit of know-how. And there is now a very propitious situation. The U.S. energy, the new energy bill is very favorable for nuclear power. The technology, there's a good technology base in Japan, Korea, and France. China and India have huge markets for nuclear power. They have the markets. And capital is relatively free to rent these days. At the time of the 3 Mile Island accident, short-term lending rates were 18%. Very, very, very impossible situation for capital-intensive projects like nuclear. But we have to ask very honestly the questions about whether we have what it takes to do it. However, there are, we see a lot more students interested in nuclear. We see a lot of leaders in the energy business. Mike Wallace, Constellation Power, doing a great job, and the Jim Reinsch in Bechtel, and and John Rowe and Oliver Kinsley with Exelon. A lot of interest about a new generation of nuclear power plants in this country. And the situation looks better than ever. But there are some barriers to nuclear power. Conventionally, we think of it as something constrained by negative public perception. Nuclear has become emblematic of bad things: big government, bad government, big opaque, business, unresponsive to public interest, and these things. Also, the safety problem gave way to the security problem. The terrorist attacks on nuclear power plants and these kind of fears. Nuclear waste seems to be a global issue for eternity, and it is very capital intensive. And often the question asked is whether we should have nuclear power or not. That's typically what is discussed. What we should also be discussing is whether we can have nuclear power, because there are some important issues with nuclear, and how soon and how we get there. For example, if one asks the question, can we have new nuclear power, we have to really try to get it. How many? We have to ask a question of the following form: how many reactors can the world build? And the answer is hard to really pinpoint scientifically, but it really is no more than 3. That comes as a great surprise to most people. The world cannot build more than 3 reactors, of which probably 1.75 is Arriva, is the French company, the French conglomerate, and the rest, the Japanese and maybe the Koreans a little bit, and maybe the US can do some things. But the US has no nuclear industry. Other than the fuel situation, the skills and industrial capacity to manufacture reactors are not here. So it has to be an international effort, it has to be a global effort. Now, assuming that this is the case, and I think this is optimistic, what it means is that on a global scale, we can build about half a reactor per year. Is this enough to mitigate what is coming with global oil peak? There are studies, the MIT study and the University of Chicago, excellent studies, but we have to really get a lot more serious about studying this problem. What it would take to make nuclear a successful part of the mitigation for energy. And even this half a reactor per year may be optimistic. Let me go a little fast here. We don't have a roadmap of how to get from half a reactor per year to maybe 5. Or do we need 5? Should we have 10? What will it take to make a dent in what is coming ahead in terms, because all of the mitigation strategies with the exception of efficiency standards and so forth, they all require a prodigious amount of energy, and nuclear can provide that energy. And who owns this kind of strategy? Is it a national strategy? Is it a global strategy? How do we get there? Where do we need to get? All of these questions. We know the situation about fuel and so forth. We probably have enough uranium. This is another discussion, another presentation. But I don't believe we have had the kind of picture, the kind of clear picture that we need to have, given the importance of the situation and given the importance also of nuclear as a mitigation strategy. Some thoughts, and I'll stop at this point and open it to discussion. Peak oil is a world-class event. It's not just a conspiracy theory, a watershed moment of human history. It's amazing how little understanding there is of peak oil, and even less understanding of how we prepare for it. Nuclear power can produce primary energy. It's probably one of the best options we have in the long term for a source of primary energy to be able to do all the things with liquid fuels, and also preserve oil for the plastics and pharmaceuticals and to some degree agriculture, aviation, and so forth. But we need to develop a roadmap. We need to take a very close look. We need to look also at the problems associated with the depletion of skills and the manufacturing and the industrial capacities to rebuild a nexus that will enable the development of the next generation. Timing is of essence in all mitigation strategies, and there's no doubt in my mind that the time to act, the moment of truth for the new nuclear generation is now. We have to start acting now. I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for some questions and comments from the audience. Dr. Upadhyay, wait just a minute. Let me give you the mic.
Your tables and graphs do not show oil reserves in Asia, such as in Indonesia, for example. Are they too small, or?
Oil reserves in Indonesia, for example, this was a very important issue. In the Indonesian Filipino oil was very important issues in World War II, the way we got to war with Japan, because we embargoed oil from that part of the world to Japan in the 1940s, early 1940s. Indonesia is experiencing horrible depletion problems. In fact, as far as I know, Indonesia, although an OPEC country, is now importing quite a bit of oil, and they have horrible depletion problems with natural gas. And last year, for the first time, they reneged in some of their obligations for natural gas to Japan, because they didn't have enough natural gas for their own fertilizer industry and their own agricultural needs. Horrible depletion in Indonesia. The only part of the world that seems to have some prospect for a major oil discovery is South China Sea. But if history is any guide, South China Sea is contested by several countries, China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and so forth. And usually when there is this kind of situation, individual countries tend to exaggerate the potential for oil there. I know Greece and Turkey almost went to war for the petroleum reserves of the Aegean Sea. And the most they've been able to get out of there, it was in the early 80s, about 20,000 barrels of oil per day, and now it's less than 5,000 barrels of oil per day, and expensive sour crude oil. But that's basically I don't think we have another giant field in Asia, other than the Caspian and the Mesopotamian fields.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, well, I have a question. It has to do with that number of 3 nuclear power plants that you think that how did you come up with that number? And my basis for asking that is that I've visited nuclear production capabilities all over the world. And I agree with you that the United States is weak. We do not currently have the infrastructure. But if you look at it globally, with the French capabilities of producing heat exchangers and pressure vessels, and the Japanese capabilities, heavy steel technology, if we look at it from an international perspective and put together a consortium of international participants, it seems to me that number would be greater than 3. And
it has to be greater, and it has to become greater. We have to get to about 10 to make any. But if you look at the number is historical. If you look at the numbers, the number of power plants in construction, nuclear power plants in construction, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Nuclear Association have these numbers on their webpage. You'll see a lot of plants listed, about 10 or so. Actually, the total number is maybe around 20. They have 8 plants in India, for example. They have a plant in Argentina, Atucha 2, which has been stalled. 80% of the plant is ready. It's been sitting there for the last 15, 20 years, and I just recently learned that the Argentinian government wants to complete it. So the actual construction, if you look at what the Japanese have built and the French have built, it's no more than 3. No more than 3. Okay. If you want to get to 4, and as you know, all the major nuclear players, Areva and Bechtel and so forth, they're bidding for 4 reactors in China. They're going to be stretched beyond, to the limit to get these obligations done. And I'm sure they will do a great job. And they have a lot of software with great project management and a lot of things, and they're going to get a young generation of nuclear engineers and engineers in general up to speed in maybe 5-10 years to be to have a leadership group for these projects. But it's going to be a challenge, a major challenge. The number 3, in my mind, is a conservative number. On the historical, if you take out all the plants that really have been in construction for decades, and you look at the actual plants, we know the Japanese can build a plant in 4 years. But from beginning to end, it's probably more like 6 or maybe even more. But a lot of the nuclear power plants around the world have been sort of in slow construction or stalled, but they're still listed as in construction.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments from the audience? Okay, let me remind, we do have a few new faces as usual in the group today. And I want to remind everyone, and particularly the new people, that we do have a reception downstairs on the second floor, and everyone is invited. So, but before we adjourn to the reception, let's express our appreciation again to Dr. Tsoukalas for his presentation today. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Good. Very good. Let me tell you now, Lovelock didn't play on green sheets. That was Patrick.
Patrick Moore, but
Yeah.
Lovelock was the co-founder, actually. Was the